The reading this morning will come from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 13. Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." And he was afraid, and arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servants there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers." He lay down and slept under the juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he rose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." So he said, "Go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?"
Hey, Rod, could you set that up here? It's not reading it every time. Thank you. Good morning. Look around this morning, I see lots of smiling faces, and I think it might be because we got rain. It's not as much as we need, but it at least looked like rain when it was coming down. It was so pretty, I went outside and stood in it for a minute just to enjoy it. When I took the dog for a walk this morning, it sounded like it was raining with just the water falling off the tree leaves. And we need that kind of rain, but we need a lot more of it, and I appreciate that. Thank God for the rain, and don't forget to thank Him when you pray. We need more, and pray for that, and appreciate that. An update on my niece, her niece's daughter. She only has one kidney, and it is not doing well at all. And she's too young to do anything about it, really. And so high fever and all kinds of infection things going on, and they're just trying to stabilize her right now still. So please keep little Hazel in your prayers. I told my niece when she named her that, I said, "You should never name a child Hazel." But anyhow, that's a different story. It's an old-fashioned name. It's not a modern name. Is the reason why I would say that. Okay, so there we go. Maybe I'm gonna get it to work or not. I don't know. Story is told of two Texans. They go up to Minnesota ice fishing because they've heard about it their whole life. And they get up there to do some ice fishing. They set up their tent. They fire up the chainsaw and they start cutting a hole in the ice. And all of a sudden, a voice comes from above. "There are no fish under the ice." And one of them looks at the other one. He said, "Did you hear that?" And he said, "Yeah." And he fires the chainsaw up again. He says, he hears this voice from above. "There are no fish under the ice." And he turns around. He says, "Is that you, God?" He said, "No, this is the ice rink manager." You know, people who don't know God's voice, they may not hear Him when He whispers. They resemble a lot like the fishermen at a skating rink or in an ice rink. And maybe if your life's off key, it's because you've developed such a deafness for the Word of God that you don't hear Him anymore. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit this morning. There's one thing I do know, if you don't silence those competing voices in the world that are constantly shouting for your attention, eventually they're going to deafen you, and you're not going to be able to hear God's word. Because what happens sometimes when God tries to speak to us is he can't get a word in edgewise because all the rest of the world is shouting at us all of these other things. I mean, we've got to watch the Hogs. We've got to watch the Dogs. We've got to watch the Yankees. We've got to watch the Cardinals. We've got to watch whatever's going on. And that's just the sports world. Did you know it's deer season right now? Muzzleloader season. We've got to be paying attention to muzzleloader season. Did you know that Halloween's coming up? Did you know that Thanksgiving's right around the corner? You know they've already got Christmas decorations out in the stores? Woo, and there's an election coming up. And I promise you, if you turn on your TV or your radio, in the next month or so, you're going to be bombarded. And it's going to be hard for God to get a word in edgewise any way you turn around, because there are so many things competing for our attention. And when God speaks in a still, small voice, sometimes we can find ourselves deafened by the roar around us to the point where we don't even hear him. I know that. This morning we're going to talk about God speaking to us, or God talking to us, or God being with us during difficult and challenging times in our lives. Many of us have gone through what's sometimes called a valley experience. We've gone through difficulties in life. We've gone through the loss of a loved one, or we've gone through a trial of some kind, or we've gone through a job change, or we've gone through something that caused us to be just a little bit discouraged. Maybe we got a doctor's opinion that wasn't what we wanted, and maybe we had to have a surgery that we didn't have any, 30 years before we never dreamed we'd have that surgery, and now we're a survivor of that particular surgery or whatever. And so there's many of us who have gone through things like that, and we've seen it. And we're going to look this morning at an example from the life of Elijah. We're going to look at a situation in which he felt all alone, but by the end of the account, we're going to notice that he wasn't all alone. He never was all alone, even though he felt all alone. And neither will we ever be all alone, even though sometimes we may feel all alone. And the reason for sharing this message is the same reason for sharing Jesus' words on the cross. Lama, lama, sabachthani. My God, Eloi, Eloi, lama, sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? God never forsook Jesus. God never forsook Elijah. God never forsook Moses. God never forsook David. God never forsook you. And he won't. And that's the reason why we're studying the lesson. Because out of all the messages that we can know in the world, out of all the hope that we can have in the world that we live in, there is no greater hope than the hope that God is still with us always. And we need that. We need that. We live in a world where sometimes the church has been marginalized. We live in a world where sometimes the teachings of the church have been criticized. We live in a world where we as Christians sometimes have been ostracized. And at the same time, we need to know that our God is still with us. He still loves us, and he hasn't stopped, and he won't stop. So we're going to look at Elijah this morning and find some lessons here, I hope. The chapter 19 starts off with the idea, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Now, what had he done? What prophets did he kill? What's this story all about that leads up to this point? And so we got to look at that before we can kind of really understand what we're talking about. And I know many of us are familiar with the story of Elijah. But just in case we need a refresher, and I think it's always good to have a refresher, let's look and see, what did he do? What did he do? In chapter 18, where the story of Elijah is really told there, we find a really familiar story about Israel. The people of Israel have turned away from God. Now, Israel's the northern kingdom. By this time, they had two kingdoms. They had the southern kingdom, which was Judah and parts of Benjamin, and they had the northern kingdom, which was everybody else that hadn't completely left God. But in the northern kingdom, they had turned away. They were following Ahab was their king, and Ahab was just a bad person. Ahab was just a bad person in general, and he had led people away from God. And so there was a challenge issued by Ahab, or issued by Elijah to Ahab. It says, hey, bring here all the prophets of Baal. It's time for us to have a confrontation. And so he challenged the people, and he asked them, he said, you need to make a decision. You need to make a decision who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve God, or are you going to serve Baal? And the people, they thought it was silly that he would ask them that. But the truth of the matter is, we're still asked that question today. Are you going to serve God, or are you going to serve the things of this world? Because Baal was no more a god than your bank account is. Baal was no more a god than your car is. Baal was no more a god than your favorite sports team is. Baal wasn't a god. It was just what they worshiped. And today we worship so many different things that sometimes we lose track. And maybe today it's time to challenge us again and to say, are you going to worship God, or are you going to worship whatever it is that you choose to worship in place of God? That's the question that he asked them there. And so he devised a test, and he came up with this idea to test the people, and to test Baal. As he got ready, he told them about, hey, let's get a sacrifice ready, and you get a sacrifice for your God, and all of you, 450 prophets of Baal, all of you, we want you to prepare your best sacrifice and do it exactly right, and then call on your God, and I'll call on my God, and the one that answers by fire will be proven to be God. Well, they seemed to think that was a good idea. They believed that Baal was God. There's another name for Baal. If you look through the King James Version, he's referred to sometimes as Baal Allah. He's the same Allah that many people worship in the world today. He is not the same Elohim God of Israel. He is the God only of Arabs, and he is a hateful, spiteful God who believes everyone else has to be destroyed. And so there's a confrontation between the true children of God and the followers of Baal Allah. Think that ever happens today? Maybe, just a little bit. Yeah, still the same people worshiping the same not God. And that's something that we ought to realize and recognize when we see this. But the thing happens, and he has them prepare their bull, and they prepare it. And then he looks around, he says, you need to offer sacrifices, and nothing happens. And so he says, hey, you need to yell more. Maybe you need to wake your God up. Maybe he's asleep, or maybe there's another problem. And I love the way he says that. At noon, now they've been going for 3 hours. They've been cutting themselves. They've been screaming. 450 of them dancing around, hoping that their not God, that they believe is God, will respond in some way. And so at noon, Elijah mocked them. This is from the English Standard Version, saying, cry aloud, for he's a god. Either he's musing, or he's relieving himself, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. Your God's not really God. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Maybe that's why he can't hear you. And so that's what he says. He makes fun of their God. Today, when we stand up in the pulpit, when we stand up to our friends and we say there's only one name under heaven by which we must be saved, which is the name of Jesus Christ, some people get their feelings hurt. They feel like we're making fun of them. Elijah took the bull by the horns here. He just out and out said, your God's not God. It's time to wake up. All the people of Israel are gathered around. They're watching. He's making fun of them over here. Probably some of them had their feelings hurt because their mama worshiped Baal, or their grandpa worshiped Baal, or they've been worshiping Baal all their lives. And now he's making fun of it. He's making us sound silly because it was. And because today, if somebody says, I follow this book, and they don't, it's silly. That applies to us too. That applies to everybody. Well, I follow the book. Do you? Do you? Do we? I follow Jesus. Do we really? Did they really? So then Elijah called on God, and he says, hey, God, I want you to do something. No, that's not what he said. Elijah called on God, and he says, answer. And God goes, poof. Most theologians would say it was probably a lightning bolt that came down out of heaven that consumed the sacrifice and the stones and lapped up all the water. I don't know what it was. I know it was the power of God and the fire from God that fell from heaven and immediately showed that God is God. And if you notice the time, if you're reading through the text at the time, it was the time of the evening sacrifice when God showed himself at the appropriate time. And so Elijah, being a good man, there you go, at the time of the oblation, at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah came near and asked God to do what he was going to do. And finally, if you look down there in verse 39, finally the people confess, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. They had to see it to believe it. They had to see it to believe it. You know, I know people today who will tell you, well, I'm not going to believe in nothing I can't see with my own eyes. That's the way they were. The stubbornness of their hearts was tremendous. The actual truth of the matter is they didn't believe it even after they saw it. Then Elijah commanded that all the prophets of Baal be taken out and put to death. They took them out to the brook Kishon, and they put them to death there. And so now we know the full story of all that Elijah had said and done that Ahab reports back to Jezebel. He goes to Jezebel and tells her all of these things that have happened. And I'm sure he's distraught. What we know about his wife is going to tell us a lot about why he was distraught. Elijah goes out to have a pity party. Ahab goes back to tell Jezebel. And when he goes back to her, I'm sure he didn't want to talk to her, because the history that we know about Jezebel says that she was a pretty strong-willed individual. And her husband was not a very strong-willed individual in so many ways. He was weak in the presence of Elijah. He was weak in the presence of his wife. He was weak in the presence of the people. But she wasn't weak at all. She was strong. And now he's got to go back and talk to her. Jezebel was a Phoenician. She had led Ahab away with her worship of Baal. She used money from the temple treasury. Understand, she used money from God's temple treasury to pay the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. She used God's money to pay false teachers. She was just not a very good person. If you've ever heard of a woman referred to as Jezebel or a Jezebel, it was never a compliment. When we refer to a woman as Jezebel, and we usually think of her as some scary old hag that was covered up like I almost said a name, but covered up with makeup and nasty looking and things like that. No, Jezebel was a hottie of her day. She was. She was one of those that attracted people's attention. They liked Jezebel a whole lot. They followed Jezebel. Ahab basically turned the kingdom over to Jezebel. He was pleased with her. He may have been the head of the household, but she was the neck. And there's no doubt about that. In verse 2, we learn that she put out a hit on Elijah, to use a more modern terminology. She said, hey, you're going to die. This is a promise from the queen. And so he ran south from there, from Carmel, Mount Carmel, which is where this occurs. He runs south from there to Beersheba. That's in Judah. So he ran several hundred miles. Well, actually, he ran about 100 miles. And he didn't run the 100 miles literally. He left. He went 100 miles away. And when he got there, he was tired. He got there and he stopped and he sat there and he didn't know what to do, and he rested there a little bit. And then he goes further south all the way to Mount Horeb. Now, Mount Horeb has another name in the Bible. It's referred to also as Mount Sinai. And we don't know exactly where it is, but we know it's all the way across the Jordan River outside of Israel, outside of Judah, back in the wilderness land that the Israelites traveled in before they came to the Promised Land. We know it's in there, somewhere in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So he's gone now a long, long ways is where he ends up, as far as he possibly could, literally to the end of the world, to get away from Jezebel. And it doesn't make sense in some ways to us today, because we think, Elijah, if I had seen what you saw, if I had seen those prophets of Baal dancing around like morons, if I had seen them dancing around and watched God not do anything, and then asked God, hey, can you do something? And God went, bam! And I saw the power of God right in front of me, I wouldn't be afraid of anything. Is that true? Is that true? Because I can tell you, I have seen lives that have tried to find help here, or tried to find help there, or tried to find help in a bottle, or tried to find help in dope, or tried to find help in sexual immorality, or tried to find help in whatever other god they're following, their money or whatever it is, and they failed miserably because there was no God there. And I've seen other people whose lives were changed, bam, just like that, by the power of God. I've seen it with my own eyes. You have too. The transformative power of God in somebody's life. We've seen it. And yet, like Elijah, a lot of times we run and hide from the pressures of the world. Just like him. His self-pity can be seen really strongly in verses 10 and 11, where it says that the angel of the Lord asked him, why you're hiding in a cave? I mean, why? Why are you hiding in a cave? And Elijah, he's I'm the only one. I'm the only one that's being faithful. You ever feel like you're the only one being faithful? It happens sometimes. Doesn't happen as often in the church building as it does in our families or at our workplaces or out in public when we're out somewhere. Sometimes we feel like we're the only voice in the world that's standing up for God. And we feel so alone and so miserable that nobody else in the world cares. And the truth of the matter is, God told Elijah, I've got 7,000. We don't even know how many God has that are still standing firm and standing faithful. We don't know. All we see is ourselves. Elijah was likely suffering from what we call burnout or depression. He was probably pretty much at wit's end, about ready to throw up the white flag and surrender. And he had expended a whole lot of energy in serving the Lord, especially during this engagement with Jezebel's prophets. And he'd been on this spiritual high, and then he crashed and he falls into this morass of despair. And he gets into this point, and during low times in our life, it can be really, really hard for us to see hope and to see the light. That's why God kept asking him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then in verse 15, God tells him to go on his way. But during these really low times, you know what we forget sometimes? God's still there, and he's still taking care of what we need the most. That's what we see here. He's low, he's depressed, he's asking God to take his life, and an angel comes and ministers to him. When we're depressed, when we're low, when we feel all alone in the world, our God is still there for us and with us to take care of our needs. And so it's often necessary for us to recognize the low times and the tough times. And the truth of the matter was, God wasn't through with him. And God's not through with you yet. If you're still breathing this morning, God still has a use for you, and he still has a plan for your life. It's not something that you retire from. It's something that you retire into, if anything. And so, since he had a plan, he kept asking him over and over again, what are you doing here, Elijah? I've got somewhere else for you to be. I've got a better plan for you to be. Sometimes in our lives, we can get so caught up with what's going on in our lives that we're not out doing what God wants us to do because we're focused on ourselves. And we're focused on our own misery sometimes. And the Lord told him, go, return on your way. You know, I think that's kind of interesting. Return on your way. When you arrive, you'll anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. By the way, Hazael. But yet I'll leave 7,000 men in Israel, all who've not bowed the knees to Baal, every mouth that's not kissed him. You know, God says, you're not the only follower. You're not all alone. Go back and do what needs to be done. Go back and take care of what I need you to do. Jesus told us to go into the world and teach the gospel to every creature. When he sent his apostles out by twos, he sent them out and he says, don't take a purse, don't take extra garments, don't take extra shoes, don't take anything with you. Just go and do what I'm telling you to do, and I'll take care of whatever the needs are. And the book doesn't say, and they came back hungry. The book doesn't say, and they came back with their clothes worn out. The book doesn't say, and they came back miserable. The book doesn't say, and they came back all disgusted. The book says, and they came back rejoicing that people had actually listened to them. They didn't think that was going to happen. They didn't have enough faith to believe that people would actually listen. But when they went out, people did listen. Well, not everybody. If everybody had listened, we wouldn't have the crucifixion scene not long after that. But some listened. Some listened. See, Elijah had a misunderstanding. He had a misunderstanding of God's presence in his life. He thought that God was all about the big things. And he was looking for the big things. He believed God's present if I can see him. You know, when I go out at night and I see the stars, I know there's a God. When I see the sunrise, I know there's a God. When I'm out at noon and I look around and it's one of those days where the sun is not miserably hot and I look around at all the beauty in the world around me, I know there's a God. I can feel his presence. I can see his power. When I hold a brand new baby, I know there's a God. Have no problems during those times. And that's the way it was. But when things went wrong, such as when Jezebel was trying to have him killed, his faith wasn't quite as strong. Maybe God has forsaken me. And maybe things aren't as good. You know, most of us like the mountaintop experiences. I'm afraid of heights. That terrifies me to look at that picture. But most of us like the idea of being on the mountaintop with God. There's a song a cappella sang back years ago, I'd love to live on a mountaintop and be fellowshipping with the Lord. There's another song that I remember that came out about the same time, about somebody being so heavenly minded they were no earthly good. You know, sometimes we can find ourselves on the mountaintops to the point where we can't help anybody else. But wouldn't you like that? Wouldn't you like if you could go someplace and nothing of the world could corrupt you there? You could be there with just you and God, communing together with God, and none of the cares of the world, none of the concerns of the world, none of the troubles of the world, none of the trials of the world could ever come and bother you there. Wouldn't that be a great place to be? It's called heaven. It's called heaven. And it's prepared for us. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that place. Elijah was one of those that glorified those mountaintops. You know, all too often, we're willing to serve God when things are going great. But when things get tough, we drop out of service. When things get tough, it's easy for us to just kind of quit. Leonard Sweet shares a story about a Native American initiation process for young boys. When a young boy would turn about 13 years old in a particular tribe, They would take him out into the woods, far from the village, far from anybody he knew or anything that he knew. But before they took him out, they would have a celebration. They would have a big bonfire, and they would blindfold him and lead him out into the woods. And then they would leave him alone in the woods with no one around on a night with no moon. It had to be a night with no moon. And he had to stay out in the woods all alone that night with no weapons. And he would hear the animals rustling around, and every one of them sounded like a bear, I'm sure. He would hear the wind rustling, which made sounds like whole armies of enemies coming towards him. He would hear all of the noises of the night, the screams of panthers, if there were panthers in the area, the sounds of the coyotes yipping. And you know they're bound to be right next to you, about to eat you. And then finally daylight would break, and we would realize he wasn't in some dark, dismal place. He was in the beautiful land in the forest with the flowers and the trees and all the things. And over next to a tree near him, he would see his father standing there where he'd been all night long, protecting his son. He couldn't see him, but he was there. We can't see God, but he's there. He doesn't leave us alone in the darkest of nights. No, he's right there with us, and he's protecting us, and he's watching over us and taking care of us. No matter what experiences we undergo in life, God is always with us. Isaiah 41:10, fear not, I am with you. I'll strengthen you. I'll help you. I will uphold you by my righteous right hand. That's God speaking. God taught Elijah a lesson. It was a lesson Elijah needed to know. He needed to get Elijah's attention. So since Elijah was impressed only with the big things in life, God says, okay, if that's what you want to see is the big things in life, let me show you. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. Behold, the Lord passed by. A great and strong wind tore through the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the earth was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of, I learned this, a still small voice. A still small voice. You know, that's what he saw. But you must understand, God got his attention with mighty acts, but God spoke to him in his heart with a still small voice. Sometimes we're so busy looking for the big things that we miss God trying to talk to us on a day-to-day basis, saying things like, hey, you know what? You should be thankful for your wife of 40 years. You should be thankful for the relationship. You know, I had trouble sleeping the last couple of nights. I don't know about the rest of the men in here. I'm used to having a particular head lying right there on my shoulder while I'm sleeping at night. And although she may sometimes feel like she's 7,000 degrees lying next to me, I miss that. I miss that. And yet those small blessings, those small ways that God speaks to us, are the ones that sometimes we don't even hear. We pick up his word and we're reading through there and we see something that causes us to realize, hey, I need to change an aspect of my life. I've got part of my life that I haven't fully given over to God yet. He doesn't speak to us and beat us over the head with a Bible and say, you better change. No, rather, he gives us free will to change or not change. He just says, I want you to love me. And we read that and we say, oh, I do love you. I love you so much. I am willing to change whatever this is. And so we work on that. You know, sometimes we get discouraged and worn out and all of those kind of things. And I believe this scenario taught Elijah an important life lesson, that God's always with us. You know, whether it's in our preaching or Bible class teaching or our family studies, whether it's in our, and I love those, by the way. I hope you're taking advantage of that. On the fourth Sunday night when Rod and Judd go to all that effort to put forth a study for your family, I hope you're not just taking that as a skip night for church. I hope you're actually taking that with your family and sitting down and going through those study guides, going through those questions, reading those scriptures together as a family and growing closer together, because that's the purpose of it. But whether you're doing whatever it is that we do, sometimes we just get a little discouraged. Sometimes we need each other. Sometimes we need to feel the presence of each other and the presence of God. Sometimes we get discouraged and we say, God, why aren't you talking to me anymore? You know, you used to talk to me all the time, or maybe even like Jesus on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? What did I do? In those quiet times, last week we talked a little bit, or last month, we talked a little bit about fasting. And maybe sometimes we ought to fast. Maybe we ought to fast from the television. Try doing that for a week. I'm not going to turn my TV on for a whole week. I'm not going to turn on any of my electronic devices that provide entertainment for a week. I'm going to still make sure I get the necessary news I need. But I'm going to avoid entertainment for a week. And I'm going to fast from that and spend my time worshiping God. Maybe you might find out that God's been there the whole time trying to talk to you, and you just couldn't hear him for all the background noise. My wife is one of those that when she speaks, oftentimes she has to repeat herself because she has a small voice. I guess that's because she has a husband with a very big voice. And that maybe she's just, I don't know, but she speaks with a quiet voice. If there's a lot of noise on when she's trying to talk to me, I have to turn the TV off, or I have to mute the TV, or I have to turn the radio down or something, or I have to say, huh, and she says, like my mom used to say, a pig says, huh, you pull his tail, he'll say, God still speaks to us. The psalmist says, the words of God, be still and know that I am God. You know, I want to encourage us this morning by assuring us that God is still there. Hebrews 13:5, God says, I'll never leave you or forsake you. If you're going through a valley experience right now, maybe we can help. We can pray with you. We can encourage you in many possible ways. But I want you to know, if you're going through a valley experience, you're not alone. God is still with us, and God is still with you. Maybe it's time for you to listen to that still small voice of God and to recognize it for what it is, to confess Jesus as your Lord, to repent of your previous way of life, and to put Jesus on in baptism so that you can walk with God as he wants you to. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation in any way, won't you come while together we stand and sing to him.